computer.
Lovely.
Okay, well, good evening. And Phil G0UFB and I will be talking about Top Band and what we might do to bring about a little bit of AM activity on the band. So I'm going to begin by talking about life on Top Band, and Phil will come in with something a little more technical, I think, towards the end. So to begin with, we might have a little review of the history of Top Band. So here we have a timeline, and the band that we now call Top Band was initiated at the IRC conference in Washington in the USA back in 1927. So in fact, we're looking at a band which will be 100 years old next year. So perhaps we're doing something here to prepare us for its 100th anniversary. From that, it ran through up until the cessation of amateur activity with World War II, and following World War II, there were restrictions in using the band, mostly due to navigation initiatives that had been installed in the time that we were off the air. The band that we know now really came into existence in 1953 when our Postmaster General defined the band from 1.8 to 2 megs and put into place the power restrictions that we all lived with for a very long time. Now, it seems that Top Band was probably much more used back in those days, and there may be a number of reasons why that was and why things have changed since then. So let's just have a think about those. So here we are. I'm not suggesting this is a typical Top Band operator, but in fact, back in 2017, the Sun did a survey in the UK and found that a typical British garden is 50 feet long. It also has 10 types of flowers and a single garden gnome. They also mentioned that it is likely to have a set of garden furniture, a barbecue and a water feature, but nowhere does it mention an antenna of any kind, and quite specifically not anything that is likely to be 132 feet long. Now, I don't think that gardens have changed significantly between the 1950s and the early 2000s. I think that gardens probably are generally smaller in new build homes, but I don't think it really is so much of a factor as to keep everyone off the band. In the ISWL Monitor magazine last month, in the amateur bands report, it said that Top Band was moribund. So I'm hoping that what we're going to do will change that. So back in the day, or at least in the 1950s and the 1960s, Top Band was a popular band. I think probably for a lot of us, it was certainly a favorite. And that I think the zenith of activity can probably be fairly well established, but I think that what really hit Top Band was the rise of VHF in the 1970s. And obviously, a lot of activity was seen around that period, the late 60s, early 70s, with the G8 calls, the Class B licenses, as they were then known, because I think a lot of the G8s were a lot more enthusiastic than the G3s that were just running out towards the end of the 60s and the G4s that came after. If there's any disagreements with that, I'll be more than happy to to admit that that is purely an opinion and not based on any kind of statistics. But why was Top Band so popular? Well, certainly there were lots of scratch-built radios. Certainly Radio Constructor, Practical Wireless, the RSGB Bulletin, as it was then, carried a lot of low-band transmitter and receiver designs. They tended to be quite straightforward. And then, of course, there was a huge amount of services surplus equipment around, some of it transmitting and receiving on 160 meters out of the crate, and some of it with really very straightforward modifications. It was often referred to as being a gentleman's band, and certainly my own experience as a young person listening back in those days, I think found that most of the guys that I heard on Top Band tended to be polite and I think enthusiastic, or tended to be very enthusiastic youngsters. I think at that time, the Top Band was also well known for what has become known over the years as the organ recital, where you get a group of older chaps on who take turns in describing the failures of their personal organs. But it was also very popular as a mobile band. And I was saying to Phil when I was talking to him earlier this week that I actually saw a photograph in a 1960s shortwave magazine, which was from a rally where there were over 100 cars with Top Band antennas on them at what in those days was a mobile rally. I think that, you know, that says something about its prevalence. But certainly Top Band was easy to access because a lot of medium wave radios tuned down that far. It wasn't too much of a stretch for most people with a small screwdriver to twiddle their IF transformers in order to get a medium wave radio to put in fairly good performance on 160 meters. And then, of course, there were lots of trawler band radios that you could buy from Lasky's and some of the other technical shops and so on. So I think that had a good following of shortwave listeners as well. Certainly where I was in North Kent at the time, that they had a net every weekday morning, and it was listened to by many veterans of World War II, a lot of residents in Cheshire Homes, for instance, people at home who felt part of something, and there were probably about a dozen or 15 regular amateurs transmitting on 1980 AM every day. So, of course, again, AM gave that access. So it was the way I think that most people got into amateur radio. Certainly the way that I did anyway. So if that was so ideal, what went wrong? Why is Top Band now just a couple of 100 kilohertz of hissy noise, mostly? Well, we have the hardware now, that's for sure. I think that there is almost no mainstream commercial rig that doesn't include Top Band. But is it the antenna? Quite obviously, VHF makes it very straightforward. A lot of the HF bands, fairly small antennas. Well, do you really need a garden the size of Whipsnade in order to get on the air on top band. This picture is not a particularly accurate rendition of an antenna that I had back in the, well, around about 1970 when I was living in my parents' house. But I had a wire that came from my bedroom window to a pole at the end of the garden. It was a new build house. It had a fairly small garden. The builders were still on site. So I had a pole that was made of steel gas pipes that for some reason I was gifted those in the evenings after everybody had gone home, and they made an excellent antenna mast. But it went down the garden, which was very short, down the pole, and then I had a zigzag, in fact, going to and fro across the end of the garden, which gave me excellent reception on top band. I didn't at that time own an SWR meter, but I would have said that it was probably pretty well resonant somewhere on the band. But that did allow me to get this QSL card as a listener report from W1BB, and I was certainly very proud of that at the time. Well, still am slightly, because obviously I still have it. But those kinds of antennas, I think, can be really effective. Now, this is a QSL card from a nearby amateur, Keith G3OXH, who's now silent key. As you see, he was mobile in his Ford Anglia. He had a G3FIF base-loaded whip, a thing for which I would have given my eye teeth probably in 1972, but he worked all over, mobile, on top band, running 10 watts. And he certainly wasn't running more than 10 watts because it just wasn't possible from a car in those days. But, you know, that is proof that people did that back then. And nobody seems to work top band mobile anymore, do they? Not at all. Here we are. Now, you may recognize this name at the bottom of this QSL card. Again, working mobile on top band. You see what antenna he was using. I think the only tricky part of this is, how do you get 35 feet of feeder into a car? That aside, he was working G3OXH. So as you see, I mean, he is going to be somewhere around about Broadstairs. That's down, you know, sort of east on the coast. Keith around the sort of Gravesend, Northfleet area on the Thames. It's, you know, it's not DX, but it's a good distance. So these two, according to this, I know this was on different days, but that they were regularly in contact. Between them, they had two antennas. If you put them end to end, they're less than 10 meters long. And yet they were maintaining good contacts on top band across the county. So here we are. This is the photo that dear Mr. Partridge used to put in his adverts around about that time. This is his car with his joystick on the roof. And as it says, don't stop your car, change bands automatically. Obviously, if you have an aerial that's not resonant on any known frequency, you don't need to change anything when you change bands. And all of that was done with the Joy Match, which I'm guessing most of us remember in one way or another. It was a simple L match tuner, but it worked exceptionally well and gave the joystick, I think, I think in practical terms, it gave the joystick a good reputation. I think everybody liked to knock it because it was easy to criticize. But essentially, it proved that if you have anything that will radiate, you can make contacts on it. And even on top band. So I know this has been fairly unscientific. It's been a jaunt through some history. My question is, are we locked out of top band? And if we are, what is the reason for that? And I think the answer is what we as operators think about in terms of our antennas. That we have everything to get going on top band, but we don't have the aerials up in the air. And so our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to get back onto top band in 2026. So for me, that's the end of my part of the presentation. And I now will hand over, I hope, to Phil, who will give us some good, solid scientific engineering information.
You know what? Has anything changed? Because, oh, no, I'll tell you what. The button has appeared on there instead. There we go. How's that? How's that? Is that sharing?
Yep.
Come on, out the way. I know it's been recorded. Come on. Out the way. There we go. You got that?
Super.
All right. So, Chris' talk has very eloquently illustrated how top band once was the essence of amateur radio, I think. And I'd like to think that there is still a fondness for 160 meters. This is just my opinion, but I think that modern amateur radio has moved away from top band through a desire to get on the air quickly with commercial kit, ready-made antennas, and least effort. The CB syndrome, if you like. Once upon a time, there were shops and magazines that offered components and second-hand bits and bobs. Just take a look back at any of the old copies you might have of Practical Wireless or the Bulletin, as it was then. And I used to spend many hours going through the adverts for things like, a dual gang tuning capacitor or a step-up HT transformer, having got some ideas from Pat Hawker's Tech Topics column, I should say. Now, I could spend $3,000 in an instant with Martin Lynch. I hope you disagree with me, because I'd love to think that most amateurs are still experimenters at heart and not just operators. Anyway, without drifting into a Trumpian rant, the message from me is, don't worry about achieving the 5.9+++ booming signal and the perfect setup. As Chris has said, just give it a go, whatever you can muster, whatever's at hand, and you'll be surprised at the results, hopefully pleasantly. So I'm going to take a quick look at, as we've already said, is possibly the most difficult aspect of getting back on top band, and that's antennas. I'm not advocating any antenna in particular. Your circumstances, your choice. But I'll give you a personal example from someone who has a small garden, neighbours I want to get on with, and a very modest budget. So here we go then. Half-wave dipole. Yep, the classic. It's something that as amateurs we could rely on and know that it's pretty much going to perform every time. But of course, we're talking about a length of, just about 80 meters, 260 feet. It's a big old antenna. That's quite a span to have to try and support. And if you feed it with a balance feeder or a one-to-one coax and a balun, then a one-to-one balun and a coax even, then you've got the difficulty of trying to support something in the center of a span that's quite heavy. So there are lots of practical issues, obviously, not only supporting that span, but potentially long feeder and the losses that accompany that. But it is simple, it is effective, And if your own circumstances allow you to place the centre of that dipole somewhere that can easily be supported, then it may be a good option. Moving on to the end-fed, similar length if we're talking about the half-wave end-fed antenna. It's unbalanced, as I'm sure you know, needs a counterpoise and an RF choke. It would also require an impedance transformer at the feed point, usually a 49:1 or 64:1 for the M-fed half-wave. Or you could throw up a random length, something that is less than a half-wave, and try it with a 9:1 impedance transformer as well. Again, you'd need the counterpoise and very likely an RF choke. The advantage, though, of the end-fed is clearly you could have the feed point nearer the shack, up against the house or something like that. So you can take the heaviest part and support that more easily, and then bend the rest of the antenna to suit the available site. So something similar to Chris's initial antenna that he had back at his parents' house. And clearly there are variations on these two, slopers, inverted Vs, off-center fed, L-shape, upside down U, and so on and so on. There's dozens and dozens of examples on the internet, lots and lots of resources about antennas similar to this. And this is one that caught my eye. It's the linear loaded dipole, a fancy name for a folded dipole. Has the advantage that the span is now something like 30 to 35% shorter than the full half wave. And as you can see, it basically takes the two halves of the dipole and folds them back on themselves, as it were. Obviously, the two ends are not connected, otherwise you've created a loop. And you could easily create the top section rather like you would creating open wire feeder, just some spaces to keep the two elements separated and supported at each end, and then a one-to-one balun again and a coax to feed it. Still pretty long span though, 54 meters. That's going to take a bit of supporting, especially at the center, as we've already said. Looking at the right-hand side diagram, an option, and this is quite an efficient way of doing it, is to use 450 ohm open wire line and create the whole antenna using the 450 ohm line. Obviously, at the two support ends, you would join the two halves of the 450 ohm together, but leaving the center connection open again as before, and then just dropping the rest of the 450 ohm down as your feeder. And at a convenient point, just connect it to the coax in a waterproof box, something like that, very similar to the way the old G5RV was connected. And then you would feed that into your shack, but obviously needing a coax RF choke on the coax before it goes into the shack. Some similar practical issues, as we've said, supporting that sort of span. But again, it could be a sloper, could be an inverted V, and so on. And the radiation resistance of that is somewhere around 35 ohms, so quite respectable. So let's move on to what is probably an obvious choice for a small garden, the vertical antenna. In this case, I'm going to look at the coil-loaded short vertical, and that is because it's less than a quarter wavelength for the radiating element. You can see there are two styles, the single element, which is with the coil at the bottom, and then the double element, where the coil is somewhere in between. Now, if the loading coil is at the base, i.e. the single element, that is the least efficient. Moving the coil up towards the middle is more efficient, and more efficient still would be to put the coil at the top. But as always, the trade-off is as the coil goes higher, then it gets larger, And so you end up with the um, practical issue of quite a heavy coil at the top of your radiating element, which might be difficult to support. Unless, of course, you could mount the coil again on the side of the house, taking the weight, and then drop the radiating element down at the side. You'd need a pretty tall house, but nonetheless, could be done. With any of these things, ground radials are a must. I'm sure you know that. But short vertical antennas are easy, they're inexpensive to build, and they can be very effective with a low angle of radiation. So I'm just going to take a quick look at what sort of dimensions might be involved if you were to do a single element loaded vertical for 160 meters. So here's some assumptions. Let's just assume we want this to be set up for 1.8 megahertz. The diameter of the radiating element, H1, I've just assumed 1.25 millimeters for something like some aerial wire. And the length, I've assumed at about 7.5 meters, reasonable sort of height that you might be able to get a mast. And if you use K7MEM's little website, he shows that with those sort of parameters, you need a loading coil with an inductance of about 166 microhenries. He's also included a very useful little coil design calculator as well. So again, assuming that you use 14 SWG enameled copper wire, you could use the same wire that you used as your radiating element, 1.25 millimeters. Doesn't matter. You just enter that into the little calculator. But I've used, as an example, 14 SWG copper wire. It's thick enough that it's almost self-supporting. And on a 4-inch PVC pipe, you would need 44 turns. That gives you an LD ratio of about 0.8 to 1. And they tell me the optimum is about 0.5 to 1 for length to diameter ratio. So pretty practical sort of figures come out of that. You would need plenty of radials though, and the rule of thumb seems to be number rather than length. So better to have lots of shorter radials than fewer long ones. And you would tune this by removing the turns or adding more turns, depending on which way you wanted to go to move the frequency, rather than shorting the coil out. So using that little example, I had a go at making a coil-loaded short vertical for 80, 40 and 20 meters. And this is what I ended up with. It does actually tune 20 meters well, although at the time I wrote this, I was concentrating on 80 and 40 meters. It's a 5.5 meter telescopic whip, which just screws into the top of that coil, as you can see in the photograph. The coil has a slider to shorten the coil length, rather like a roller coaster inductor. And I know I've just said take turns off, but because I'm using this multiband, clearly I couldn't keep winding and turns on and taking turns off. So I used that. It is base loaded. You can see the coax feeder going into the bottom of the coil. The coil is insulated from that angle bracket, so the feeder goes into that. But it's also elevated slightly on the tripod. You can just see the tripod in the bottom of the photograph. And that has kind of the happy benefit of some of the advantages of raising the coil, even though it's base loaded, because you've got the high current point a little bit higher in the air and therefore reduced the ground losses. And it does improve the radiation resistance slightly as well. So it's base loaded, but it's elevated slightly. As a result of that, the radials from it, and you can just see the radials come away from those wander plugs, they are in effect counterpoises now rather than radials because they don't touch the ground. They just slope down at, I don't know, about 30 degrees, I suppose, to some insulated pegs. And the sloping down, as again, I'm sure you know from antenna theory, does raise the radiation resistance slightly. So 4 elevated radials or 4 counterpoises. You'll notice in the photograph there the green wire, which was an earth connection. And originally I tried this because I thought, okay, I'll have an earth stake as well as the radials. And I found that was not as effective as just using the radials on their own. And I think that was because it actually introduced the ground losses more and therefore made the VSWR look better than it really was, because I was losing a bit of power into the ground losses rather than it going into the antenna and being radiated or part of the radiation resistance. So I took that off. The green cable was still on when I took the photograph, but I took the earth off. And yes, the VSWR went up a little bit, but actually the performance was better. And when I put the antenna analyzer on it, I got a smoother response for the reflected signal and for the SWR. So I was able to get, by moving the slider of the coil slightly, I was able to get quite a good SWR and reflection loss down to about, I think it was about 1.7, 1.8, which I thought, okay, that's not too bad. And then I went up and put the Shack ATU on it, antenna matching unit on it, and the antenna analyzer. And I got a really nice, deep, clear null at about 1.01 or 1.02 SWR. And obviously, if I wanted to change frequency slightly, then I was very easily able to just retune or fine tune, if you like, using the Shack ATU to move that null to the frequency that I wanted to. But I got a really nice deep null there. So I was very happy with the results from that. And obviously, as well as the antenna analyzer giving you an idea that you seem to be heading in the right direction, it's always good to see what sort of on-air results you might get. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with these things. Forgive me if you are, but I found these little resources very useful for checking the on-air antenna performance. So using the weak signal propagation report, WSPR, the little WSPR device, I peaked the vertical to the frequency of WSPR and set that going for a couple of hours to see what sort of results I got, and I'll show you those in a moment. And then using the reverse beacon network, again, quick summary of that for those of you who aren't familiar. You log on to the reverse beacon network, put out a little CQ or a test call on using CW, and within a matter of moments you get a response back from the various beacons that have picked up your signal. So you can see how well you're getting through, and you get like a little signal to noise report as well. And again, I'll show you that in a few moments. But as well as checking the performance, it's always good to know the propagation and how that's going to affect, because obviously if you tune up your antenna and put out a call and you think, my goodness, it's not working very well, it might just be that, of course, you picked the wrong time of day, etc. And another few resources which I've found really useful. One is HFDXView, as you can see there, and that's the sort of top-ish left with like the pink boot over England. That covers down to 1.8 megahertz, and that was 160 meters at whatever time of day that was. I took a quick screenshot. So you can see, wouldn't be much point in me saying, oh, I'm going to try and talk to somebody in Spain, but UK and Northern Western Europe was okay. You've also the Voice of America um, uh, prediction. That goes down to 2 megahertz on the VOCAP Marine. The normal VOCAP amateur radio only goes down to 3.5 megs. So for top band, you'd need to use the Marine one. I know it's not quite covering top band, but I guess it's near enough to give you an idea as to how things are going. And that's the top right hand screen there, and you can see the sort of propagation wheel you get, and sort of going around in a clockwise direction is time. So 000 at the very top, and so on round in a clockwise direction, and then from the center going out, you get the various bands. So 80, 60, 40, 20, so on and so on. And then finally, open ham clock. That is kind of like a radio ham dashboard. There was a few bits online about ham clock is now moribund because the chap that was running it's passed away, etc., etc. But open ham clock is kept up to date and is very useful. You can overlay that with propagation prediction as well as different layers on who's active, etc. So that's quite good to see the activity on the band and see what sort of activity around Europe or something like that. So as I say, this was, these are the results from my little vertical antenna. I did these this morning, so not the best time of day, but if you look at the reverse beacon network on the left-hand side, you can see that on a frequency of 7 megahertz, just over 7 megs, it was at 2 o'clock, and we were getting something like, I don't know, 200 miles, 600 miles, 500 miles. Not too bad, I don't think, not too shabby. And signal to noise of 12 dB generally. So that was quite good. Little map of the top there, so you can see we were getting into Central Europe quite happily. And then on the right-hand side, 2 tables, just snapshots, because there's a lot of results on the tables, of the Whisper results. The top one is 7 megahertz again. And you can see that, what were we talking? The second from the right-hand column is distance. So, yeah, that's actually in kilometers this time. 1150, 1300, 1200. So not too bad. Not too bad at all. That was with 200 milliwatts out of the Whisper transmitter. And then the bottom table is 3 megs, 3.5. Similarly, not quite as far, sort of to 400, 300, 420 kilometers. So, time of day, etc. Pretty encouraging results, I thought. So, really, the AMAR's top band challenge is to get back on top band. And as you've just seen, it is quite easy, really. There's lots of resources to draw on, and there should be no reason why we couldn't re-enthuse people or to get back on and give it a go. And that's the aim. Invite you to give it a go over the next few months. For me, I've got a 7.5 meter SOTA pole, and I'm going to try that homebrew coil that I talked about earlier. Just run a wire down the length of the SOTA pole to the coil at the bottom, and just run out as many radials as I can. So that's going to be my plan. And hopefully we'll meet back on the Zoom club meeting of the 19th of June to sort of have a little natter about how everybody's got on, the sort of experiences they've had, share a few ideas and so on. And we would like to launch a top band operating event. Nothing to, not a contest or anything like that, and probably not as formal as a net, but some kind of operating event on top band. Committee will think about that over the intervening months, and then we can launch some kind of operating event on the 19th of June. But that's it. Hope it's inspired you to have a go, and good luck with your efforts. That's it from me. Let me just stop sharing and then.
Thank you.